That's when I'm going to see the bank manager or my mother, who's 97 and still insists on collar and tie when my brother and I visit her, which I'm delighted to say. And recently this year, I was also elected chairman of the British Association for Local History. So I have lots of interests. I don't think I'm going to live long enough to satisfy my curiosity, because the first thing you need to be an historian is you need to be nosy and curious and what went on. History was so boring at school, names, dates, places. I failed O-level history. I needed maths and physics to be a navigator anyway in the merchant navy with P&O. And it's only my travels around the world as a teenager that I never knew any of this existed. And I took up the interest, and I've visited and taken guided tours around battlefields all across the world, although I'm not a trained soldier and I don't pass armchair judgments on people. I'm not qualified to, but I do like looking at the evidence and trying to understand what it was like for the people, either at the top or at the bottom or in between, for the experiences they went through. Now, Gallipoli, 1915. Gallipoli is an intriguing operation, and I'm going to try and cover it comprehensively as I can, with a touch of local flavour over the next few minutes. The background was that Turkey, after failing to respond to the very weak overtures from France and Britain, declared war on the Entente on 31st of October 1914, and the Turks engaged the Russians' fleet in the Black Sea, and therefore Britain reciprocated by declaring war on the 5th of November against the Ottoman Empire. The first War Council in Britain met on the 25th of November. Asquith, the Prime Minister, Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, and Kitchener, General Kitchener, now the Secretary of State for War. Churchill focused on the seizure of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, initially rejected, although the preparations were made for more resources to protect the Suez Canal. So despite the heavy involvement and the prime focus, of course, on the Western Front, the geopolitics and supplies and the trade with the Empire meant that focus had to be maintained on security in the Middle East. January 1915, Lloyd George wanted to pursue a more energetic, if you like, global war, allied with Churchill. I won't say against the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister Asquith, it's very difficult to gauge what he thought. You know, he was anti-war, he was anti-conscription, and he spent a lot of his time in cabinet writing love letters to his mistress, including giving away all the secrets of what they were discussing at cabinet. And the latest ones have just published in a book only earlier this year. It's quite fascinating. Makes me glad I've never had a mistress, but we won't go there. Okay, at least she did keep her mouth shut, so there we know. But January the 15th, Lloyd George proposes a defensive in France, realising this is going to be stalemate. We've now got the lines of trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland. So let's go in, through the Balkans. Austro-Hungary was seen as weaker than Turkey. But what circumscribed his proposal was that the Turks started to advance in the Caucasus, and this led the Russian Tsar to ask for help. And this then went back to Churchill to get the backing of the cabinet on the 13th of January for a naval expedition to take Constantinople and put the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, out of the war. And it had to be a naval expedition for two reasons. A, the army's pretty busy in France and it's not big enough, and it still need to be, all the new volunteers are still training, and the major battles of 1915 have shown the horrendous casualty rates and how much manpower was going to be needed. So there wasn't going to be a strong military involvement. And secondly, of course, he's First Lord of the Admiralty. And apart from mounting a blockade, what are the Royal Navy doing? This is a job for the Navy. Quick look at some of the characters involved. Lloyd George Churchill, Kitchener, and outside the Admiralty we have Jackie Fisher, who had been recalled as a First Sea Lord with the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill again. So these are the key persons looking at this strategy of outside of Europe, outside of Western Europe. Mediterranean geography is quite clear. You can see the Strait of the Dardanelles is a very strategic point, very easy to defend, as the British and French were going to find out, along with their imperial troops. And of course the trade from Egypt. British troops are in Egypt and in Palestine, protecting the canal. In fact, they'd already fought a battle. By the time the Gallipoli campaign started, there had already been an attack by the Turkish army on the Suez Canal, and they were driven back. And that's the reason why troops from Australia and New Zealand were being sent to the Middle East instead of coming to the Western Front at that time. Tactical people, well, we have the Kaiser, we have the Ian Hamilton, who commanded the expedition to Gallipoli. We have General Stopford. These names are going to come up time and again. General Stopford is of a particular interest because he was put in an impossible position which resulted in the loss of many lives and the loss of the campaign. And his grandson is one of my friends and colleagues in the Chatham Naval Officers Association, which happens to be secretary, and he shared with me some of the family story about it, which gives it a personal appeal. And we have Kitchener when he visited Gallipoli later on, and General Birdwood, who eventually took over command at the end of this story. Just names, don't have to learn them or fix them, but these are faces of some of the names I'm going to be talking about, some of the people I'll be talking about a bit later on. This is rather a good picture of the Dardanelles Straits and the Aegean Sea. The landings were going to be here, here, and later on up there. Anzac, the British and French were around here. French mainly on the Kumkali side, the Asiatic side, and the British army was here. But before the army gets involved, of course, you've got to force these narrows. Now you try taking 6 or 7 British or French battleships through these straits. Would you rather be doing that, or would you rather be defending them from heavily armed forts or with lots of mines and submarines? It's one, you know. So the Navy goes in. Admiral Carden, the admiral we saw earlier on, receives his orders for an attack as early as the 5th of February. So the tempo, we've only had, this is 3 weeks after the first War Council meeting to decide on strategy. 3 weeks later it's in action. On the 6th of February, the Royal Marine Light Infantry of the Royal Naval Division, including Chatham, sent to the Eastern Mediterranean, and the 29th Division, which was the only spare division available in Britain, was ordered to Lemnos, an island in the Aegean near the peninsula, to be. That order was rescinded, and it was decided that they needed to be kept in reserve for France because they're so desperately short of men in France, and they came up with this idea of diverting the Anzac troops, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, on their way through Suez Canal to Britain. They decided that they would get off in Egypt instead. Troops at this stage of the Gallipoli plan were solely there to occupy the forts after they'd been destroyed by the Navy. So we're not looking at constituting an invasion force or an amphibious force of any size. There are 3 lines of defence in the Straits. As I mentioned, forts and mines. Forts are supported by artillery and searchlights. On the 19th of February, the heavy ships of the British and French Mediterranean fleets open up. and the Turkish guns remained silent. They weren't going to give away with their flash, they weren't going to give away their exact position. And because of the flat trajectory and the types of shell employed on these battleships that were designed to fight each other, not some land target, the attack was ineffective. The only conclusion you can come to is the fleet training before the war in both Britain and France had been based on heavy gun ship-to-ship encounters. By the 25th of February, the fleet, which was large, did succeed in clearing the first line. But then it stalled and it struggled. Between the 26th of February and the 18th of March, 3 weeks, the fleet struggled to overcome the Turkish forts, despite using the 15-inch guns of the latest class of modern dreadnought, the most powerful battleships yet constructed, HMS Queen Elizabeth. They had to make a decision. If these guns aren't working, how and what are we going to endanger? Are we going to risk the loss of a super dreadnought like the Queen Elizabeth, which later served in the Second World War alongside its sister ships, or are we going to what are we going to do? And there was a sort of stalemate in thinking. General Burwood arrived in the Aegean on the 1st of March and consulted with the Admiral, Carden, who was in charge, and advised Kitchener that actually there's no way this operation could be completed without grasping the nettle and undertaking a major invasion of the peninsula at Cape Helles, that southernmost point. Churchill rebuffed this by saying, oh, don't worry, by the 16th of March it'll all be over. We're going to be in the Sea of Mara and we'll be the other side, we'll be approaching Istanbul. On the 4th of March, the Royal Marine Light Infantry landed at Kumkali and Sedilbar, either side of the peninsula, to demolish fortifications, but were withdrawn after taking heavy casualties. So these preparations, with the naval assault and then with the initial infantry assault, failed. They didn't get beyond the initial Turkish defences. The mine sweeping also failed by the 11th of March due to a lack of power in the trawlers employed. They didn't have enough power to overcome. There's a very strong current runs down the Dardanelles. I've been through it myself on the ship, and you are full ahead when you have against the current. And these trawlers started going backwards. They didn't have enough power when the current was at its strongest to get up the channel. And there was a failure to locate and destroy the mobile artillery, which the Turkish army had now put in place in addition to the fixed forts. They'd had plenty of time, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to prepare. So, on the 10th of March, Kitchener changes his mind again and orders the 29th Division to the Eastern Mediterranean and appoints General Sir Ian Hamilton to command the expeditionary force of 5 divisions, and he arrives on the 17th of March. The day he arrived at his headquarters, he found out that the Admiral Carden had gone sick and his deputy had assumed the command of the fleet. So this final naval attack led by de Robeck, 3 lines of attack with the initial gunnery success followed by disaster from guns and mines. 3 major warships, battleships are lost: the Bouvet, the Irresistible and Ocean, severe damage to battle cruisers Inflexible and Gaulois. And on the 19th of March, 2 days after Hamilton has arrived, the Admiralty have to suspend the attack. These narrows, these minefields, all these forts, gun emplacements, the big ships just cannot penetrate this defensive screen. When the Inflexible, a large battle cruiser, was hit a mine, we see that the captain, Richard Phillimore, he wrote that the electric light failed and most of the emergency oil lamps were extinguished. Men stationed in A magazine and shell room were thrown off their feet. The fore turret was felt to lift bodily, so this is 110 tonnes of armoured steel being lifted bodily by the explosion. Because remember, turrets sit in the barbette, they're not fixed. So when these ships capsize, you see the wrecks, you see the turrets have fallen away sometime before. All communications failed and orders to the engine room had to be conveyed by messenger. The trim was corrected by flooding the provision room, but the ship remained down at the bow by 6 feet. Casualties amounted to 3 officers and 30 men killed and 13 wounded, and effectively the ship is put out of action. So, Hamilton and the communication with London are somewhat ambiguous. They seem to pass each other their messages, or Hamilton chooses to understand Kitchener's intentions somewhat differently to how Kitchener understood them. And you see this mix-up in their communications. The effect that after Hamilton and de Robic met, there is still there's no documentary evidence to see that there's a clear decision made. We do know that there was, the decision was made to carry out the invasion, the landings, but you cannot find anywhere in the evidence who actually made the decision, who is responsible for it. Is it a joint one? Which one of the two convinced the other that this is what we're going to do? There was no overall commander-in-chief. There was no, we had in the Second World War, a supreme commander in a theatre that would have the final say. There were neither naval nor military nor logistical resources in place for such an operation, which meant it then had to be delayed by another month. So this is another month of preparation time for the Turkish defenders. The idea of the attack was to land, as I said earlier, around the point of the peninsula. The French would land in Kamkali. Some French troops also landed here. The Anzacs would be sent in further north. And the whole purpose was to take this village early, Krithia, at the base of the high ground, Akibaba, which is where my hand is now. That was the key to the peninsula. Get that high ground and you can command the rest of the peninsula. It was never taken. In fact, the troops never got further than that line in the whole of the time of the campaign. And the Anzacs never got further in than a couple of miles. And the later landing in Suvla Bay, similarly, didn't penetrate more than 3 miles into the interior of the peninsula. Landing, you can see how, I use the word improvised, but my own background in merchant shipping with cargo ships and everything else, when you read the accounts of how the ships were loaded, how they would transport, how the cargo was done, often the cargo was in the wrong order, it had to be unloaded several times and reloaded again. There'd been very little amphibious training with the soldiers, even very little with the Marines. I found evidence of 1 or 2 exercises around about 1910, not just a raiding party, which is what the Marines carried on board ships were for, but for a coordinated landing operation against opposition. And you can see, you know, the trucks, the artillery being on a raft, being towed by a trawler, and all sorts of things. And on the other side, we can see how well prepared the artillery of the Turkish army was. They'd had another 3 weeks to stock up on ammunition and everything else. An old collier, the River Clyde, was used on one of the beaches, the Hell's Land. It's a very famous picture, this. The soldiers walking down the gangway. By the time they were walking down the gangway, the Turkish army already had fixed line machine guns. So it was an absolute slaughter. And they just kept coming. Thousands of men were carried in the Clyde, got down to the boats. Some got ashore, a lot of them didn't. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I transcribed the record from Lieutenant Guy Nightingale, who was in the 1st Battalion Royal Munster Rifles. He gives a description about setting off in open boats, seeing the men drop in everywhere, and of the first boatload of 40 men, only 3 reached the shore or wounded. At the same time, we ran our old collier onto the shore, but the water was shallower than thought, and she stuck about 80 yards out. So rather than getting up onto the beach, she's 80 yards out, as we saw in the picture. This left me the only officer. We dug ourselves in, the Turks sniping at us from every corner, and I've never spent such a rotten night. So if that's not a fantastic understatement, I don't know what is. And of course it was raining. He carries on that they were ordered to take an old ruined castle full of Turks, then a village, and finally a hill. What after that? The castle we rushed at the point of a bayonet and lost only a few. The village was an awful snag because, like any house-to-house fighting, it's absolutely deadly. Worst position to put infantrymen in. The Turks retired 2 miles and never attempted to counterattack, but of course we got no sleep that night. The next day the French relieved us and we had the day off except for shelling and made our returns for casualties. We lost 14 officers and 400 men in 24 hours. All the streams were simply running blood and the heaps of dead were a grand sight. We lost 4 officers and 200 men. And then the Turks counterattacked on the 1st of May. They'd landed on the 28th of April. We now total 4 officers and 430 men out of our original 1,000. Out of my own company of 230 men and 4 officers, there are only 31 men and myself. And he finished his letter by saying, just got the chocolate, films and mail, many thanks. It's incredible. These letters are incredible when you read them. I find them very moving, very matter of fact. And then you read letters from the other side. Major Mahmood was on the V Beach. The fire changed the colour of the sea with the blood from the bodies of the enemy. The sea whose colour remained the same for years. Shells and machine gun bullets fell ceaselessly at the points where our rifle fire was observed. In spite of this, heavy fire was opened from all our trenches. In a vain attempt to save their lives, the enemy threw themselves from the boats into the sea. The shore became full of enemy corpses like a shoal of fish. Landings took place on other beaches that day involving British, Australian, New Zealand and French forces. However, the landing on V Beach was the bloodiest. So it confirms and ties up with the observations of the previous. The Anzac landing further north. Yes, it is the Anzacs not going to Europe. So they're about to land. And in Australia, the War Memorial, and I lived in New Zealand for a number of years, the Gallipoli is still it's a centre of remembrance in the country. And from the Australian War Memorial, this picture shows their landing. My goodness me, not much of a beach left there, is there? Look, you're faced immediately with that cliff. Physically, it's bad enough without somebody shooting at you. You know, it's just incredible. And Henry Barnes from the Australian Infantry. The Anzacs, where they landed, they were lucky in one respect. There was only a strengthened battalion led by Kemal Ataturk in front of them, and many of his men didn't have any ammunition for their rifles, but he had them all laid down and waited and waited and waited, and then when the Anzacs appeared at the top of the rise, whatever ammunition he had, he let fly. And of course he was the man that came to power in Turkey after the dust settled after the war. But he was a very, very impressive commander, bought enough time for the reinforcements to arrive. And we end up trying to avoid this trench warfare in Europe. You end up with trench warfare on this peninsula. And then there are many identical features of trench warfare. His experience of a Turkish counterattack He wrote home and said that the Turks were throwing bombs, grenades, as well as rifle fire, and it was very difficult to avoid the occasional man that came over. There was one fellow right in front of me. He was shot by me and by the fellow next to me. 2 or 3 of us shot at the same time. He came through practically on top of my bayonet, and he was a very big man and came down right on top of me, and none of us could lift him out. He was too heavy to lift 3 feet while you kept down out of the range of fire. You've got to keep your head, you put your head up, it's gone. I sat on that Turk for 2 days. We ate our lunch sitting on him. We were eating our bully beef and biscuits. My goodness, it's almost like the reverse of a picture telling 1,000 words. These words, you just get a flavour of something you can't imagine yourself. Right, the link to Chatham and the Medway was that the Royal Naval Division, using sailors and Marines who were not employed at sea, consisted of the equivalent of 9 infantry battalions, and the RMLI from Portsmouth, Deal and Chatham, they landed at Anzac, whilst the Plymouth Battalion landed at Y Beach at Helles with the remainder of the RN Division. After a few days, after a couple of weeks, they removed the RMLI from Anzac and sent them back to rejoin the division at Helles. They were relieved by the arrival from Egypt of the 1st Australian Light Horse Brigade and the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade, many of which you would have heard of from the fame they secured here, and then later on in the Palestine campaign that followed towards the end of the war. On the 13th of July, the Chatham Battalion led the attack, the 3rd attack on Aki Baba, remember, bursted through Krithia village to get to the high ground. The assault was set for 1630. It was delayed until 1650 and came under immediate heavy shrapnel fire, incurring heavy casualties. By 8 o'clock in the evening, 2000 hours, 155 Brigade reported that nothing had been seen of its attack. There is no more record of that battalion. There were some survivors that got back, reconstituted, but in the war diaries, there's no mention. This is the last mention of them is in the brigade report. Many of the reports are missing, of course, and they're not written under ideal circumstances anyway. So that was the end of the involvement. That attack was the end of the involvement of the Chatham Royal Marines. HMS Goliath, one of the earlier dreadnoughts. Chatham built and Chatham manned. As you know, the Navy, until 1960, the Navy manned its ships from Portsmouth, Plymouth, or Devonport to be correct, and Chatham. The idea being that men having a permanent base for and with their ships, they could then use married quarters, and you could establish family life, etc. And it was a more efficient way of manning ships. On the 12th of May, Goliath was sunk by a Turkish gunboat with 3 torpedoes. Ian Hamilton, who was a very erudite general, in fact, he wrote a fantastic book on the Russo-Japanese War, which he was an official observer. And one of the ironies is when you read that book, he describes all the tactics employed by the Japanese and Russian forces, both at land and at sea, during that war. But none of those lessons, he relayed all the lessons, and yet none of the lessons were applied effectively until 1918 in the services. The comment he made in his report was he thought the Turkish captain deserved a decoration. Well, maybe he did. The Goliath sank in 3.5 minutes with only 183 survivors out of a crew of 800. So a devastating attack. Again, proving the folly of putting these big ships through a narrow, easily defended channel. On board were 2 15-year-old midshipmen, Torquil MacLeod and Ronnie Fade. Churchill had defended the practice of early deployment of cadets, as they would learn incomparably more of their profession in war than any educational establishment on shore could teach them. There was quite a debate in the House about this. about the fact having under 18-year-olds. In the Merchant Navy, there were boys of 12 and 14, you know, being torpedoed and everything else. But for the services, there was this argument about having, you have to be over 18 to be able to go overseas, this sort of thing. Their parents, as a result of their loss, their parents received a half refund of their training fees, because at that time, you know, parents paid for apprenticeships, paid for training, and if you were a naval cadet, your parents had to pay the fee. And the government, in all its graciousness, refunded half the fee to these two boys that were lost. It's going to change later. Yeah. I think in the shipping company I joined, the New Zealand Shipping Company, I think parents paid for the cadetship £25 a year until about 1960, something like that. I joined in 1970. They had to pay me, which I'm rather grateful for. So we're stuck. We can't get any further up the peninsula, either at Anzac, not getting more than 2 or 3 miles inland, and down at Helles, stuck, can't get beyond Krithia, he can't even get up to Krithia. So what's the plan? Well, if we're going to pull this out of the hat, we're going to have to reinforce. Let's go to Suvla, remember the map at the top, and we're going to put in a new one there, a new army there. Let's commit ourselves and let's get this job done. Going in on the top, pushing that way round by the Anzac's attack, and then break the Turkish positions and army that way. The controversy of this goes, who's going to command? General Stopford commanded the attack, and one of the divisions under his command was led by General Mahon. Neither of whom had seen active service and were virtually on the retired list. But they, because of the seniority, the big debate you see in the papers is over, oh, we can't appoint this man because he's junior to this man. And that caused a major controversy. Easy to talk about that when the price is paid by thousands of other men, officers and men. The idea then, we're now getting in the summer and it's hot. 6th of August, the landing was designed to combine with this Anzac attack, whilst there was also another demonstration from Helles to distract the Ottoman army. Part of this new invasion force was the 2-4 Royal West Kents, and they landed on the 10th of August. So this landing is taking place over a week, and they get a good beachhead, and that seems to be it, because the Ottomans the Turks have reinforced, and this time they've got German advice as well. You look at the performance of the Ottoman army, when it has German commanders and advisors, it's very different to the performance of the Ottoman army when it doesn't. Kemal Ataturk was a notable exception. They stall. Stopford thinks he's done the job by just establishing a breachhead. Very similar to what happened in Italy in the Second World War at Anzio. The degradation of Anzac in Helles by this time, however, was not through enemy action, because these attacks had been repelled, and the casualties now were forced by disease and the climate. The terrain had become difficult, if not impossible, for motor or mule transport. We even had the Indian Mule Corps, which fought hard to supply the armies in the south, and the Anzacs, south of Suvla Bay, were supplied by the Zion Mule Corps. First unit in the British Army to be exclusively Jewish. And most of them are Russian Jewish emigres who've been kicked out of Palestine. And they won medals. Well, it confused people in Whitehall and the government having to approve decorations. DCMs were given to a couple of corporals in the Zion Mule Corps, and because they'd never heard of it, they never understood it. But that's another story. On the 17th of August, failure is recognised. So if we are going to succeed, Hamilton requested 95,000 extra troops. They'd struggled to send one division from France, a division of 18,000 men. 95,000 troops. So the cabinet, of course, agree, but they approve only 13,000 replacements, none of which is to come from France. By this time, there's also calls on army from Britain and France to help Serbia. And the way the war was going, it meant literally the game was up. They cannot continue to fight on this stage. They can stay put where they are and die of disease, or you're going to have to, how are you going to get 95,000 extra troops? Where are you going to get them from? Where are you going to supply them from? And how are they going to attack? On the landing at Suvla Bay, you can see how well prepared the Ottoman army was. Obviously these are staged photographs, but they do give you the impression heavy machine gun use. Fred Cokes wrote, and then of course we all got into lighters, smaller boats, and got ashore as quiet as we could. But of course the Turks were waiting for us. But us that eventually got ashore, we dug in and then we advanced when we could during that night. I think we advanced about 3 miles during that night, and that was the furthest that they got all the time they were there. They never went any further than 3 miles. We thought we were going straight through to Turkey, you see. Every soldier thought, well, you know, in a week's time I'm going to be entertaining the women in in Constantinople. Very interesting when you get the letters from people of different ranks and appointments and experiences. The expectations on these lads were tremendous. By the 10th of October, Hamilton noted that he's now got 100,000 men in the peninsula, 50% unfit. The 11th of October, Kitchener asked Hamilton for an estimate of evacuation casualties. He was thinking of evacuating them. He sort of hesitated, so he was replaced by Sir Charles Monro. All the time they're deliberating what they're going to do, troops are continuing to die of disease. On the 30th of October, Monro says, no, we've got to evacuate. Still no decision, so the government decides that Kitchener will have to go and see for himself. So he does. He appoints Birdwood, very competent officer, to command the Dardanelles army. Then we get November storms and a December freeze. So now the people that have got malaria are now getting frostbite. The physical conditions are absolutely appalling. And the campaign ends with this evacuation, which in turn becomes the best planned operation of the campaign. Very minimal casualties, hardly any casualties at all, convincing by using a collapsing bag technique. For those of you that can recall Operation Market Garden, when the village of Oosterbeek, the 1st Airborne, had to be evacuated, the General Commanding, Robert Urquhart, he remembered doing at the Staff College, his study was on the Gallipoli evacuation, and he planned the evacuation and the Rhine crossing that night on the same principles as he studied for Gallipoli. So that was 9th of January 1916. Almost a year since the conception of the original operation. So, 500,000 Allied soldiers and sailors. Half became casualties due to action and disease. 36,000 Imperial personnel lost, 10,000 of which were Anzac. Anzac Day remains, as I said, the most significant day in commemoration in the Antipodes. Ottoman, Turkish and Arab losses are also estimated at 250,000 killed and wounded, on the scale of the Western Front again, with this war, with the technology available. Finally, conclusions. I'm conscious of time. Robertson, the Chief of the Imperial General Staffs, considered that Kitchener was to blame. They love a blame game, don't they? For allowing Churchill and Haldane to have considerable influence on strategy, thus allowing the failed Eastern expeditions at Gallipoli and Mesopotamia to fail. And this goes to the heart of the division in the direction of war from Britain. The soldiers, the CIGS in particular, said, no, we need to defeat Germany in France. Forget all these sideshows. Sideshows just divert, and Gallipoli proves the point. It's rather ironic that the architect of Gallipoli in many respects, Winston Churchill, resigned because of the failure of the campaign, and then he commanded a battalion of the Royal Scots in the Western Front for about 6 months afterwards. He was responsible for, as First Lord of the Admiralty again in 1940, he was responsible for the disaster in Norway, but this time he ends up as Prime Minister. So it's an interesting comparison. Yeah. The changes of mind and weakness in command selection are the things. I'm not a trained soldier, but I do know about selection for people for command and all these sort of things. And you look at this constant change of mind. It's all very well. How does that get reflected to the soldier on the ground that's got that rifle and that bayonet? Even as late as August, we saw in Suvla Bay, we saw that private soldier still thought he was going to turn up in Constantinople in a week or two's time. This doesn't transmit itself. Capital ships should not be risked unsupported against shore batteries, mines and submarines in confined waters. And the amphibious warfare, if you're going to do it, you need to be fully committed, trained and prepared, and it's one hell of a job. The logistics to support an amphibious operation. I'll give a plug for the Royal Engineers here. One of my research areas is the Inland Waterways and Docks Department that created the harbour at Richborough, the secret harbour at Richborough in 1917, and many of the junior officers there were instrumental in building and creating the Mulberry harbours in the Second World War. And finally, instead of knocking out the props, remember we're going to knock out all these props, propping up Germany. The campaign against the Ottoman Empire proved that actually Germany was propping up its allies. Choosing allies like the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungary, was a disaster for Germany. So although knocking out the props is good, it's the other way round that ended the war and made possible the armistice in 1918. And that's it. Thank you.